if if it's impatient, if you are just dismissive, if you are, are these things happening that people look at you and say that they believe in Jesus, and if that's the Jesus that they're talking about, I don't really want it. Is really what is really the honest truth of what happened. So what part of Jesus are you advertising?
Hey, this is Pastor James Adcock on Next Steps. I'm here with Miss Darby Bell Adcock. How you doing this morning, Miss Darby?
I am doing well. It's been a little while this weekend. Some changes after the new year, but we're doing really well.
Did you think about going into 2023 there would be this much change?
I don't think I did. I actually, when people, for whatever reason this year, when people are like, what's your New Year's resolution? We kind of talked about that last week. I really didn't have one. I was just kind of happy to be like, it was I don't know if it's just I'm getting older, but I was like, just excited to go into a new year.
Sure. Another day to get something done, right?
Yeah, but actually, funny enough, when you mentioned last week, we talked about a little bit about what like our intentions, what our prayers are for going into the new year. And Pastor James over here had said that his goal is 52 books a year.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that's a book a week.
It's a book a week, yeah.
So I actually just like shortly after showed him I ordered a few books that I'm super excited about. So I am very excited about reading those books.
I was excited. I read, I think, 2 of the 3 of the books I saw. So,
yeah.
And the one that I really enjoyed that I think you're going to enjoy is Atomic Habits by James Clear. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying James Clear is a believer. I don't know anything about him as an author outside of Atomic Habits. But if we can put into practice some of the things he does to build atomic habits, spiritually speaking, mm-hmm. it can phenomenally turn our spiritual life to a dynamic spiritual life. Because I find people like, I'm going to read the Bible this year. Okay, well, that's great. That's a great goal. Yeah. And well, sometime in January, they get into the this person after this person and this person. And they're like, and they just kind of lose, interest. But we set a goal, and we set a goal that's achievable. Yeah. And then that goal continues to increase and get larger and larger. Then by the end of the year, not only have you read the Bible, but you probably gained a lot of insight from it as well. I haven't really understood, because I am one of those people that bite off more than I can chew. And I'm always like, I'm going to do all of this. But I've just been it's just been an interesting feeling of putting that into practice, of these tiny, tiny things. And then it doesn't feel like that excitement of like, oh, look what I've done. Like I build those tiny habits, and then I look of all that I've accomplished. Yeah. And it just like, I don't know. I don't know if it's just like the hype is not there. It's just more of like, you know what I mean? Sure. Like it's a little bit more grounding or settling a little bit of just like, these were these tiny habits, and I did the whole bite that I said I was going to do. It happened in a different way than I thought it would. Yeah. And everybody, there's something about the new year that brings about interest and excitement, that it's almost like everybody gets, I get a do-over. Oh, yes, you get a do-over, but you get a do-over a year later. Yeah. I'm in a year older, hopefully a year wiser. Yeah. And we hope that the mistakes we made in 22 won't be the same mistakes we make in 23. But if we find ourselves there, I even thought about the scripture last week, a righteous man falls 7 times, but rises again. Yeah. I've always heard it this way. It's not that we're going to fall. It's how long are we going to stay down? Yeah. And each of us are human beings, and we have human tendencies. I call them the bends, human bends. We're all born with this bend toward, so maybe someone has a bend toward, addiction to alcohol, or someone has a bend toward addiction to drugs. And I know there's arguments about people. They would say, well, you can stay away from that. Yeah, I understand that. But once someone kind of gets in that environment, they just kind of have this natural bend that kind of like, I really like this. Yeah. And it's just not those 2 things. There's many, there's many other things that we have bends toward. And yet it's through the power of Christ that we can overcome any of those. Yeah. And I always think of this too, of wherever it's going to be different for everybody, but whether you're saying like, oh, I get a do-over, and I know for, it's a do-over, but I also think it's I'm building this year. Like sure. for some of us, it might be like, oh, I feel like I have a few things under my belt, and now I want to build on some of the stuff that's there. So I always think that's always a good way to look at it too. And I think it's interesting we started this way, because one of the things we've been trying to do on Sunday mornings this year, 2023, in this series, Blessed to be Blessed, is we've been trying to put our feet in the shoes of Jesus's audience on the Sermon on the Mount. And I wonder how many of them, obviously not thinking about New Year's, but I wonder how many of them listening to Jesus had the same feeling that you and I are talking about, like having excitement, maybe it's starting over.
Yeah.
Maybe God does love me. Maybe God can use me. And maybe setting goals in their minds, like, man, I'm going to go to the temple. I'm going to go to the synagogue twice a week, type thing. So there's these ideas that we have sometimes, like this is all brand new, but this is probably something that every generation does. It doesn't always happen in New Year's, but it can happen because someone like Jesus speaks a message and boom, life changes. I guess that's one of the prominent popularities of TED Talks.
No, for sure. No. And I always, I know it feels like that boom or change, and I'm working with a lot of kids lately. And, I think for some of kids or some people that are like, well, how does that boom happen? How, what am I waiting for that? When does it happen? What does it feel like? And I always think that it's the shift that happens, right?
Sure.
We hear what Jesus is saying, or the people at that Sermon on the Mount of, what is it? Blessed are the poor in spirit. And anything that Jesus was saying, I just imagine instead of that, what feels like a boom moment of oh, I'm different. Really what happens before that is really that shift of I should be kind, or,
Right.
whatever that is. I think we all go through shifts, and whether you're, you want to do over of man, I really didn't get it that, this last year, or wherever you're at right now of, just having that shift is usually what happens and then that action comes of I really do need to be more patient with my family.
You've probably heard the phrase death by 1,000 cuts.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what if we had change by 1,000 shifts?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and it's slow. It goes back to James Clear, Atomic Habits, but it's these slow, methodical, deliberate shifts that eventually we've done a complete 360 if we've stayed with it.
Yeah.
It goes back to the yoga illustration we shared before of how am I going to get into yoga? Well, James Clear says, well, put on your yoga pants or get out the yoga mat, sit on your yoga mat, watch a 5-minute and boom, boom, boom. By the time, a couple months later, you're doing full yoga workout and you're just like, oh, I never thought this would happen. And you love it and you enjoy it. And it's not like something you're like, oh, this is just another chore. Yeah. And be careful here. We don't want to add check marks to our life.
Totally. I think it's so easy to feel like you're checking, but when we're talking about yoga, even what we've talked about of next steps of we're building these things on and all of a sudden of we talked about at first, just take that just 5-minute step out from your family if you can, sip that coffee, just have a moment with God or whatever that is. Are you building a little bit more of that intentional devotion time? And that we're not talking again, oh, I did the coffee, I did the devotions. It's just about building and onto what we have and making those shifts. So all of a sudden, look at our alone time with God right now.
And I think we were talking about the audience that Jesus was preaching to, but I think a lot of these shifts that you are referring to, I would think probably happened in the intimacy of the 12, where Jesus as the rabbi sitting, whether it's a campfire around a meal or walking on a trail, and not to belinger our Israel trip over and over and over, but there's so much I think we learned from it. But the idea was the rabbi was always in front. Mm-hmm. The closer to the front you were to the rabbi, the more conversation you got to have, the more you got to hear, the more questions you got to ask. And that was intentional.
Yeah.
And if you've watched The Chosen, which Dallas Jenkins, director, has done a fabulous job of doing, you'll notice every time they walk, Jesus is in the front. Mm-hmm. A lot of times Peter, James, and John are up there too, if you can start figuring out which of the disciples are there.
Yeah.
But you notice a lot of the deep conversation, a lot of the things that take place is intentional on Jenkins' part because he's following a rabbi's kind of format.
Totally.
And so you wonder how many shifts took place on those walks, those meals, and late nights.
Just for a little, fun fact, that what is the saying? And we're talking in rabbinic terms. So again, Middle Eastern way is very different than the Western culture. Very different way from, pastor is different than rabbi.
Sure.
Right? In different cultural ways, and maybe we can kind of go into that, but in the rabbinic way, teacher of the law, of the word, right? Just fun fact, so there's a saying of you always want to, be in the dust of the rabbi.
Yeah.
Like basically, like you should be so close that as they're walking, the dust is kicking up off their feet. Like you should be just as close, and that dust is right.
Yeah, and one of the things that, I mean, obviously George was kind of our rabbi for those few weeks, but Terry, she kind of brought the rear.
Yep.
So she wanted to make sure people didn't get so far behind that they got kind of lost. So she was constantly trying to push people. So where George is leading from the front, Terry was pushing from the back to make sure everybody could be as involved in that per se dust as possible.
And that's a shepherding term as well. If you guys kind of remember some of the stuff that we talked earlier, that was a shepherding format that is used in the Middle East a lot.
It's interesting because you bring up pastors and rabbis, and people probably don't look at them. They probably think they're polar opposites, but really the key word of pastor is shepherd.
Yep.
And now if you get into evangelists, that's different. You get into missionaries, it's a little different, but I think it really always boils down to how are we going to shepherd people? And I've never been an evangelist, so I really can't speak in the essence of, I've always heard evangelists, they blow in, blow up, blow out. And that's fine. And you say, well, where's the shepherding in that? Well, I think they have an opportunity to come in and kind of like a sheepdog. They're barking and they're getting sheep in line. Like, you need to do this and you're gonna start doing this. That's kind of the job of the evangelists, and missionaries are there and they're like, I want to go shepherd people that you as a church may never go to. And then of course then you have your pastors and they're like, I want to shepherd this group of people. Totally. And by the way, that's probably been the number one reason for me personally, and I can't speak for other pastors, why I am where I am. Because if it was about going to different churches with different pay or different benefits or bigger city, or these if I was like a lawyer, if I was like a different occupation where I look at, and I don't mean anything bad about those occupations, but I look at occupations as what is the best job I can get in my occupation. And as a teacher, if I can get $20,000 more a year at this school compared to this school, maybe it's something I really consider. And I'm not saying pastors wouldn't consider a $20,000 raise across a year, but what I'm saying is the common ground for me personally has always been, this is where God has called me to shepherd. So it's not about the income, it's about how do I do this to the best of my ability. And that's something I think 2023 I'm really trying to get ingrained into. Yeah.
No, I think that's great too. And, shepherding just doesn't mean just for pastors. It's used in there, but like you're shepherding your families, you're shepherding the people around you. Like, how are you tending and pouring into your family, the people around you, and how are you being patient with people? That's shepherd. How are you, kind of, that's, I totally agree. And because I've asked sometimes too of, for those of you who are just jumping into the podcast or kind of know, I've moved here for like a year. Right. I've had some beautiful town, I come from a different town, and I just have some questions I've asked of you of, why have you stayed here this long? Because it's been 17 years, or now are we at 18
we're
now?
going into 18.
Going into 18. So, when somebody's there that long, I just have questions of why have you stayed, And so we've just kind of talked about that, and just to kind of, I've seen not only the shepherding beforehand with you, but I think we talk about Israel. That's really going to be a thread that you just continue to see through this podcast, because it was just so monumental that we want to come back and bring that here too. But I've seen that even just with the people here and learning. I feel like I was never an evangelist, but I did have that kind of template. I was with that performing group, and touring. So when I would just get to go, I was with kids and people for 3 days, and then it would be like this huge, like, life-changing thing, positivity, and then we would move to the next place. So it's been so new for me to be in one place, to go through some ups and downs with people that happen when you're shepherding. So I just feel like I've gotten to watch that and learn from you and be a little bit more settled.
I think it's funny sometimes we think, oh man, I wonder if I could get on a plane, or if I get my car and I could go to a different church every week and preach to different churches. And I don't know what, if you're really, if you're booked up as evangelist, what that means, 48 weeks out of the year or whatever it is. But imagine say you're in 40 different churches throughout the year. And as a pastor, I'm like, oh man, that would be so awesome. But then imagine evangelists be like, oh, if I could just stay in one place, that'd be so awesome. You know, and it comes back down to, what has God called us to do?
Yeah.
And like you said, you know, okay, you were in a special group, music, kids, and 3 days, and then let's go to the next city. And that's what the season of your life was. And I look at Jesus' ministry, predominantly a lot of his ministry was in the Galilee area.
I didn't know this, and totally, like, if you look of where Jesus' ministry was, I mean, what was it, the circumference, or like what?
Yeah, just...
Or the mileage, I should say.
Yeah,
That
I mean, it's, I don't recall myself, but it's kind of small in comparison to, you know, the full region.
Yeah, like, I don't know about you guys, but didn't know. It was a shock to me because you know, Jesus' ministry that you talk about, of all these stories, like, you just imagine like the spread of Jesus' name, how that went. His ministry was really small, just in the area that he was.
It blew my mind when we're on the Sea of Galilee, and obviously they don't have houses like we do on our waterfronts, but that's just not part of their culture. But Decapolis, pagan, right? Tiberius, Herodians, and I might be getting these wrong, but just we pointed in different directions: Herodian, Zionist, Essens, you know, pagan,
and that for those of that means just that group of people was over there. This group of people was over there.
So when you're reading the scriptures and it says Jesus was in Decapolis, now we're like, oh, wait a minute, he's in pagan territory, or he went to, you know, Philippi, Caesarea. Oh man, well that's the place of the pan, where they went and served gods. And what's Jesus' question there?
Yeah.
Who do people say I am? Who do you say I am? And it's like he's again, we're talking about shepherding, but it's almost like Jesus specifically. And if we don't understand the geography of the Middle East, we miss out on some of the intricacies of Jesus' ministry, because we're just like, okay, he was in Decapolis.
Yeah.
But Jewish people didn't go to Decapolis. If you went to Decapolis, you were pagan.
Yeah.
And there were pigs there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And but we're like, oh, what's the big deal about that? I eat pork every day. Well, yeah, but Jews didn't.
Big, yeah, like and just again, you know, we've talked about the culture, we've talked about geography, and I know for some of you guys are like, I just want to read the Bible, and you know, if that's where you're at, that is okay. But if you are looking for something to go deeper, and what we, again, next step, so we, as simple as, if your next step is just stepping outside to have alone time talking to God with your coffee, but if you're looking for something deeper, of paying attention to geography, again, is a part of the way that we understand, because I'm just astounded again from being, when we say going to Israel, but studying the geography of the land. Again, like you said, Jesus went to the Decapolis, right? Decapolis.
Yeah.
And that sentence right there, it brings up so many other things of, oh my word, that's what this means. So the things that you have read, if you've read over and over, maybe you've been walking with Jesus for quite some time, and you've been in your word, the word is still living and active even for you. And these are some of the ways and tools that God works through.
And this is why it was so interesting to me when I was preparing for the Blessed to be Blessed series, is Matthew 4, and I think it's 23 or verse 25. He says, and they came from Judea, they came from Galilee, they came from Decapolis. And what Matthew is doing is, I think he's like standing in essence like we were on the Sea of Galilee, and he said they came from here. And I'm pointing for those who are just listening, but here in these different directions, and Matthew's like, who is, you know, in essence, maybe like this crowd, who is this Jesus that so many people would come and hear what he has to say? And
and again, just to widen our eyes a little bit more, of like and let the text widen too, of just the way and the tone that Matthew could be, again, we're speculating, but could be writing in, is again of like, just as he's saying that, it could be like when we're reading of, he came from here and here and here, and here's the story. But again, it could be like, they were the pagans, all of these people are coming here, and this is who Jesus is.
Who did Matthew write to? Do you know?
He wrote to...
What group of people, I should say?
Wasn't it for the Jews? No.
It was.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So he's writing specifically to the Jews to prove Jesus is the Messiah of that the Old Testament and the law talked about. And we kind of drew in a little bit on that yesterday, and didn't get to hammer that home any, but you know, it's this essence that Jesus said, I haven't come to destroy the law or the prophets, Now, the law would have been the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Torah, Talmud. The prophets would have been the rest of the Old Testament as they have known it.
Yeah.
And so Jesus said, I haven't come to destroy. And the word destroy in the Greek there is to loosen, bring down. He said, I've come to fulfill. And he said, I've come to magnify it. I've come to complete it. And so Jesus, in essence, when he stands before these people on this mountain, and Matthew's writing this, he says, think not that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets. He says, I have not come to destroy. I have not come to loosen. I've come to fulfill. I've come to show you who I am. I am the completion of the law. I'm the completion of the Old Testament prophets. So fast forward just with me for a little bit. Matthew, staying in Matthew, Jesus is on the road of, I think it's Luke, but Jesus is on the road of Emmaus. He's talking to disciples. They don't know it's Jesus. What does he expound to them? He says, let me show you who Jesus was through the law and the prophets. And the Bible says their heart burned within them because they had not connected the dots. I've shared with people that I follow specific Jewish rabbis who don't believe in Jesus. They believe in the Torah. They believe in God and the essence of God of the Old Testament, but they don't believe God has sent his son yet. And I'm just like, they say, what's the difference between what I believe and what they believe? I've just been able to connect the dots. And they're unwilling to do that. But I share that because there's so much history that they can give that I don't grasp until they say it. And I'm like, oh, that makes so much sense. But I say it makes sense because I connect it to Jesus. They say it makes sense because it connects to the Torah. So, and so I share that with you because I'm just like, here's doing this. Here's another example of that. So Jesus approached by the young ruler, and he says, what is the greatest commandment? Jesus goes back to the Old Testament. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. The Shema, and the new commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. And so now we have the Shema of the old, we have the Shema of the new, and the idea of the Shema is it's the prayer that is given that I'm going to love God with everything I have. I'm going to love people with everything I have. And Matthew is illustrating this to Jewish people, and Matthew specifically says not just, I want you to know that Jewish people are sitting here, but there's pagan people sitting here. Yeah. There's Herodians sitting here. There's Zionists sitting here. There's Essenes sitting here. They're all hearing the same message because Jesus is for all people.
Yeah. And what does that mean for us? We kind of, and just how do what we do with the Bible is, we always ask, some of us know this and some of us ask questions of, is the Bible for us today is something that often comes up. And what does that tell us? Again, just like that of pagans who were, a lot of that was sinful nature that, and then the people of the law, all these people came to hear Jesus. So that it doesn't matter if you have been wayward, if you've been really struggling with, pick it, whatever it is, Jesus is for you. Even if it's, you are just looking for something deeper, you're looking for a friend, your family has been destroyed, whatever it is, Jesus is for all people. And I kind of want to go back to, you mentioned, we were talking about, just going back to the shepherding about you were called to this area, and you were just talking about Jesus's call, the calling on our lives. And just kind of talking about, yesterday we talked about our identity in Christ, and we've kind of been talking about that. And just I wanted to kind of talk about how would you know if Jesus is calling you? When it's so easy to be like, well, I'm called to this area, or I'm called to do this. How do we know? And some of the steps that we take is knowing who Jesus is, figuring out more and more of who is this guy, who is this character, the savior of the world. And then a lot of that calling of our life sometimes is very intricately connected to just, I don't know who I am, Jesus, but I'm trusting you.
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head, that because the idea and the concept is, well, Jesus calls me, what if he calls me to Africa? Well, what if he does? But many times Jesus calls us to something that fits within our behavior. Now, there's someone, oh no, I know Jesus doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called.
Totally.
But that comes within time, and it comes back to what you're saying. Do I trust Jesus enough to change me if it's necessary to go where he's calling me to go. And I think this was the process of the disciples, 3.5 years of change, 3.5 years of transitioning. And even when the darkest hour came, they still failed.
Yeah.
But who was there to restore them? Interesting fact. Jesus comes to Peter, and Peter hasn't denied him 3 times, but he says, Peter, when this is done, go restore your brethren. He knew Peter was going to fail. He knew all the disciples were going to fail, but he used the one who probably felt the worst about it to go and restore the others.
Yeah.
And that's just what Jesus does. That's a trust that he has with the people. So trust kind of goes 2 ways. I trust God that he's going to put me there, but I also trust God's trusting me to do what I'm supposed to be doing.
Absolutely.
So, but yeah, it's those are great questions. And a lot of people get stuck in, well, am I or am I not? Well, I always say, you never know until you put a foot forward. And maybe that's a little bit too simple, but if you sit on the couch all day just always wondering, you're never going to get nothing done.
Yeah. No, I don't think it's too simple of just, what is that next step of just kind of asking yourself, like, what might Jesus be calling you to? And I know I always go back to, I just want to, for our listeners who are just like, I work, I can't do a lot, but maybe he's just calling you to talk to him a little bit more, of just talk to him a little bit more. Are you being called to be more of a servant? Are you being called to be more patient with your family? Whatever it is, take that one step of just that. I just think that's so great, of just taking that one step.
The calling that God has on our lives is not always glory.
Yeah.
It's not always going to be seen. And it might be like, God's called me that every time I go into a parking lot, I take all the grocery carts I can up to the thing. Well, what good does that do people? Well, it helps. That's serving.
Yeah.
God's called me to bring coffee to my coworkers. God's called me to be kind to the most unkind person at work. And those things are not glorified. Those things are not seen, but God sees them. And
so much more. I forget where it says, but just so much more is going to be our glory in heaven for that. On this earth, it might not be seen. It might be seen, but someday when we do get to heaven, that's when we're going to hear that, good, well done, my good and faithful servant.
Jesus, hey, you fed me when I was hungry. I think that's where you're heading. And well, I didn't feed you. And you clothed me when I was naked. I didn't clothe you. And Jesus, no, when you did to the least of these, you done it for me. Yeah. And I think there are going to be so many people in heaven that are going to be blown away by the rewards of the most common people of every generation, Absolutely. And we think about the Peters, and we think about these high profile people that we had, quote unquote, put, we kind of, I don't want to say put on a pedestal, but we kind of hold in high regards. 'Cause like, man, they were a person of faith, and great. Yeah. But that doesn't mean there aren't those same people in our generation today. Oh, yeah. And a lot of those things with, Peter or all these people too, I just can imagine, again, like you said, those 3 years or 3.5 years of just time. I just can imagine that we just talked about at the beginning of those tiny habits, those spiritual habits, or being at Jesus's feet, of just learning and building and building and failing and then building and building. And then all of a sudden, what do you look at? Oh my goodness, look at this person of faith. And we don't say that of, that's not like a lofty thing to attain to, but when we do say that, of one day that we hope that people will say that about us, are people saying that about you? I think one of the questions, I forget if it was last week, but just what Jesus, are people seeing Jesus in you? Maybe that's the question for this week. What sort of Jesus do people see in you? And I think we ended last week with, you may be the only Bible people read. Totally. And maybe we end this week with what sort of Jesus are you advertising? Yeah. Because sometimes, we talk a lot about church hurt on this podcast, and a lot of that, say if you are a believer, and if talking about what kind of Jesus are you showing and advertising, if it's impatient, if you are just dismissive, if you are, are these things happening that people look at you and say that they believe in Jesus, and if that's the Jesus that they're talking about, I don't really want it. Is really what is really the honest truth of what happened. So what part of Jesus are you advertising? Is it the kindness? Is it the heart of a servant? Is it being patient with your family? Yeah. And hopefully those are the tiny shifts, even if it's on this podcast, if it's you go and read a little bit more. And again, that
just boom, that quick change doesn't happen. It's just with that tiny shift of, oh my word, I've hidden this in my heart, and I'm going to take the next step of, even though my kids are driving me bonkers, or, whatever, I'm not kind to my aunt or my sister, whatever it is, that tiny shift of, I'm going to choose to be patient. I'm going to choose to have a better tone. And those are just examples of just those tiny things of being patient with the baby puppy that's at our feet right now. Of,
Yep.
whatever it is, what kind of Jesus are you advertising?
So let us know if you have questions or comments. I'm Pastor James. This is Miss Darby.
Yeah.
And thank you for listening to Next Steps.
All right, we'll see you next week.